Welcome to Threads of Evil, the podcast where we untangle the dark webs of history's most notorious killers while examining the societal conditions that enable violence. I'm your host, and today we're venturing into the disturbing case of a man known as the Monster of the Andes, Pedro Alonso Lopez. Now, before we begin, a warning to our listeners. Today's episode contains disturbing content, including descriptions of violence against children. Listener discretion is advised. In the shadowy corners of criminal history, there are certain figures whose crimes are unconscionable, that they seem to defy human comprehension. Pedro Alonso Lopez is one such figure. A serial killer who claimed to have murdered over 300 young girls across Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador in the 1970s and early 1980s. What makes this case particularly important to examine isn't just the staggering number of victims, but how it exposes the profound failures of our social systems. Despite confessing to hundreds of murders and leading police to many victims' graves, Lopez would ultimately spend just 14 years in psychiatric care before being released. Yeah, you heard that right. Only 14 years. And perhaps most revealing of all, his victims were almost exclusionary from impoverished, marginalized communities that lack the political power to demand justice or attention. Today, we'll not only trace the life of Pedro Alonso Lopez from his troubled childhood in Colombia, but we'll also examine how structural inequality, poverty, and inadequate social systems created conditions for his crimes. We'll look at how class divisions, underfunded public services, and the criminalization of poverty rather than its alleviation contributed to this tragic chapter in South American history. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 8, 1948 in Santa Isabel, Colombia, but before diving into his personal story, we need to understand the Colombia in the 40s and 50s. This was a time of immense political violence known as La Violencia, a period of civil conflict between conservatives and liberals that claimed over 200,000 lives. Lopez's father, Eduardo Reyes, was killed in the conflict before Pedro was even born. This wasn't random misfortune. It was the direct result of political instability in a country with extreme wealth inequality and limited social safety nets. His mother, Benilda Lopez de Castaneda, was a prostitute with 13 children. The absence of economic opportunities for women, particularly those without education or family support, often left sex work as one of the few viable options for survival. The lack of accessible contraception, sex education, and abortion access meant unwanted pregnancies were common, especially among the poor. By age 8, Lopez had already been exposed to sexual abuse at the hands of his mother's clients. When she discovered this abuse, rather than protecting her son, she threw him out of the house. This abandonment wasn't simply a failure of maternal instinct. It was the action of a woman with no resources, nor support system, and no mental health services to help her process or respond to her child's abuse. On the streets of Bogotá, Colombia's capital, Lopez survived by begging and stealing. Where were the social services that should have identified and supported this vulnerable child? Where were the housing assistance, the food security programs, the education outreach that might have intervened? They simply didn't exist for children from his social economic background. At age 12, a North American couple took him in, seemingly offering salvation, but this apparent rescue turned dark when an older male teacher at the school they enrolled him in sexually abused him. Here we see another systematic failure, the lack of oversight and accountability in institutions meant to protect children. By his mid-teens, Lopez had been arrested for car theft and sent to prison. In a truly rehabilitation-focused system, a juvenile offender with his history of trauma would have received psychological treatment, education, and support. Instead, he was thrown into a brutal adult prison, where as the youngest inmate, he was gang raped, further traumatizing an already damaged psyche. Lopez would later describe this as the moment when something broke inside him. He claimed to have killed 3 of his attackers while still incarcerated, though this has never been verified. What is verified, though, is that the prison served not to rehabilitate Lopez, but to further damage him. What's striking about Lopez's early life is how it reveals the complete absence of functioning social support systems. Each traumatic experience represented not just personal tragedy, but institutional failure. No support for single mothers, no mental health services, no housing security, no meaningful juvenile justice system whatsoever, no trauma-informed rehabilitation. While these factors do not excuse his actions at all, under any circumstance, they demonstrate how societies that neglect their most vulnerable members often pay a terrible price. Lopez wasn't born a monster. He was shaped by a perfect storm of trauma, neglect, and systematic abandonment. In the early 1970s, Lopez began his murderous journey across South America. The exact timeline remains difficult to establish, but his pattern of victim selection reveals a chilling exploitation of social inequality. Lopez primarily targeted young girls from indigenous and desperately poor communities, not simply because of personal preference, but because these communities were effectively invisible to the power structures of their countries. Their poverty wasn't an accident, but the result of generations of exploitation, resource extraction, and the policies that concentrated wealth in urban centers, while leaving rural communities to languish. His method exposed these vulnerabilities perfectly. Lopez would pose as a traveling salesman, a church worker, those kind of things, and approach young girls with offers of trinkets or help in communities where economic opportunities were scarce and education limited. These small offerings held significant appeal. Once he gained their trust, he would lead them to isolated areas where he would assault and murder them. The geography of Lopez's crimes is telling. He operated primarily across Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, 3 countries with profound wealth inequalities, histories of colonial exploitation, and indigenous populations that had been systematically marginalized. These were not random choices. They were hunting grounds where structural inequality created perfect conditions for predation. In 1978, Lopez narrowly escaped a group of tribespeople in Peru who caught him attempting to abduct a 9-year-old girl. The tribe was preparing to execute him when a missionary intervened, convincing them to hand Lopez over to the police instead. This incident is revealing in multiple ways. First, it shows how indigenous communities, lacking trust in formal justice systems that had historically failed them, sometimes resorted to community justice. Second, when they did entrust Lopez to the state, that trust was betrayed. Authorities in Peru, with police forces underfunded and overwhelmed with political instability, simply deported Lopez to Ecuador rather than investigating his crimes. That's what they did. They're like, no big deal. They just deported him. And this deportation proved catastrophic. Free to continue in a new country, Lopez began targeting victims throughout Ecuador, particularly in poor regions near the Colombian border. The failure of international cooperation wasn't just bureaucratic oversight. It was the result of political systems that prioritized other concerns over the safety of marginalized communities. One of the most damning aspects of this case was the invisibility of the victims. In regions where poverty and the political unrest were already causing disappearances, the absence of these young girls sometimes wasn't even reported to authorities. This wasn't parental negligence. It reflected a rational understanding that police forces weren't serving these communities. In many cases, rural police stations were understaffed, underfunded, and lacked basic investigative resources. Some families had to walk miles just to reach a police station, only to be dismissed or ignored because of their social economic status or indigenous identity. When reports were filed, they often languished in systems without resources or political will to investigate. This isn't unique to South America. Around the world, we see how cases involving victims from privileged backgrounds generate media attention, police resources, and public outrage, while similar crimes against marginalized people barely even register. They're ignored, swept under the rug. Just like, that's not important. The Lopez case exposes the brutal consequences of disparity. Lopez's capture in April 1980 came not through sophisticated police work, but through community vigilance when he attempted to abduct a 12-year-old girl from a marketplace in Quito, Ecuador. Her mother raised the alarm, and local merchants, not police, captured Lopez and handed him over to the authorities. This pattern of community self-protection is common in these areas where formal institutions fail to provide adequate security. It is a phenomenon where we see repeatedly in communities that have learned they cannot rely on the state for protection. Initially, the police were skeptical of Lopez's involvement in anything beyond this single attempted kidnapping. However, Detective Pastor Cordova, of the Ecuadorian police began to take Lopez's confession seriously when he provided details only the perpetrator could know. Lopez claimed to have killed 110 girls in Ecuador, 100 in Colombia, and over 100 in Peru, giving him the most horrifying total of more than 300 victims. If these claims are true, it would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. But let's examine the response to these confessions. Rather than triggering an international investigation with appropriate resources, the case remained primarily within Ecuador's jurisdiction. There was no coordinated effort between the three countries to identify all potential victims and provide closure to families or ensure even remotely any comprehensive justice at all. The investigation's limitations were not due to lack of will from individual officers like Cordova, but from systems that weren't designed or funded to handle cases of this magnitude, especially when the victims were predominantly from marginalized communities. In June 1980, Lopez had led police to a remote area near Ambato, Ecuador, where they discovered the remains of 4 victims. Over the following weeks, he would lead authorities to a dozen more graves across Ecuador. But many of the sites he claimed to have used in Peru and Colombia were never fully investigated due to jurisdiction issues and resource limitations. The patchwork investigation meant that many families never received confirmation from their missing daughters. The trauma of these disappearances continues to reverberate through these communities decades later. Another form of intergenerational harm inflicted disproportionately on those with fewest resources. During this period, Lopez received extensive media attention, earning him the nickname the Monster of the Andes. But this sensationalism rarely extended to meaningful coverage of the conditions that allowed him to operate undetected for so long, or the systematic failures that shaped his development from victim to perpetrator. In 1980, Lopez was charged with the murders of the victims found in Ecuador. Despite the staggering number of victims, he was only tried for a fraction of his crimes, a limitation that speaks volumes about how legal systems often fail to deliver true justice. Due to Ecuador's legal framework at the time, Lopez could only be sentenced to a maximum of 16 years, regardless of the number of murders. He was convicted in 81 and given the maximum available sentence. This limitation was a quirk of Ecuador's system, but reflects a broader pattern of criminal codes developed with conventional crimes in mind and not accounting for the possibility of mass murder. The most revealing aspect of this case is what happened next. In 1994, after serving 14 years, Lopez was released for good behavior and deported to Colombia. The Colombian authorities placed him in psychiatric institute for evaluation, and in 1998 declared him sane and released him on a $50 bail. This outcome represents multiple systematic failures. First, the inadequacy of Ecuador's sentencing guidelines, which failed to distinguish between a single homicide and hundreds. Second, the absence of international coordination that might have allowed Lopez to face charges in all three countries where he committed crimes. Third, the failure to develop appropriate facilities and protocols for individuals like Lopez who present oncoming dangers. And fourth, the profound devaluation of lives of his victims, predominantly poor, indigenous girls whose deaths apparently didn't warrant any more serious consequences. It's important to note that this isn't an argument for harsh punishment for its own sake. A truly progressive justice system would recognize that someone like Lopez posed an ongoing danger and required secure therapeutic containment, not for retribution, but for public safety and his own treatment. Instead, what we saw was the worst of both worlds. Neither meaningful rehabilitation nor public protection. The psychiatric evaluation that declared him sane after decades of horrific violence speaks to how mental health systems often lack nuance in distinguishing between legal sanity and genuine rehabilitation. This case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Would Lopez have been released if his victims had been from wealthy families? Would the international response been different if these murders had occurred in Europe or North America? The evidence strongly suggests the answer is no. Since his release in 1998, the whereabouts of Pedro Alonso Lopez remains unknown. Various rumors have circulated. Some claim he was killed by vigilantes. Others suggest he returned to killing, while some believe he's living under a new identity. In 2002, a murder in Colombia matched Lopez's methodology, raising concerns he had resumed killing. However, no conclusive evidence linking him to this crime had been presented. Another example of difficulties in tracking offenders across borders and jurisdictions. The case of Pedro Alonso Lopez demonstrates the urgent need for systematic reform across multiple domains. First, we need a social support system that identifies and protects vulnerable children before they experience the kind of catastrophic trauma that shaped Lopez. This means robust child protective services, family support, universal health care, including mental health services, and economic policies that alleviate the poverty that makes children vulnerable. Second, we need a criminal justice systems around the world focused on rehabilitative measures rather than punishment, particularly for juvenile offenders. Lopez's experience in prison as a teenager didn't correct his trajectory. It accelerated his descent into violence. Because it's a common fact that you put somebody behind bars, you put somebody in a cage, and you treat them like a monster, they will become the monster you think they are. Third, we need international coordination mechanisms that transcend borders to protect vulnerable populations. The ease with which Lopez moved between countries, evading accountability, reflects a fragmented approach to justice that persists today. Fourth, we need to address the profound inequalities that make certain victims less visible than others. The lives of poor indigenous girls must matter just as much as those from privileged backgrounds. In the years following Lopez's case, some positive changes did emerge. Ecuador reformed its sentencing laws, and there have been improvements in international police cooperation. However, many of the underlying conditions that facilitated his crimes persist. Around the world, we continue to see how wealth inequality creates conditions where predators can target marginalized communities with relative impunity. From indigenous women in Canada to impoverished communities in the United States to vulnerable populations across the global south, the pattern repeats. The security and well-being of all people shouldn't depend on their social, economic status or ethnic background. A truly just society should ensure that everyone receives equal protection under the law and equal access to the resources needed for a safe and dignified life. For the families of Lopez's victims, these theoretical improvements offer little comfort. Many never received closure, as their loved ones' remains were never found. The true count of Lopez's victims may never be known, and as many disappearances in remote areas during that time period went unreported, a silence that speaks volumes about structural inequality. The case of Pedro Alonso Lopez isn't just about one man's horrific crimes. It's about the societal social conditions that enable such violence and the policy choices that could prevent similar tragedies. When we examine cases like this through a lens of social responsibility rather than individual pathology alone, different solutions emerge. Consider how comprehensive social policies might have altered this tragic timeline. Universal child care and family support could have provided alternatives for Lopez's mother beyond abandoning her son. Robust child protective services might have intervened when Lopez ended up on the streets. Youth-focused rehabilitation rather than adult incarceration could have addressed his early criminal behavior. Mental health services might have identified and treated his traumatic experiences before they manifested as violence. Economic development in rural areas could have reduced the vulnerability of his eventual victims. Well-funded community-based policing might have detected his pattern of predation earlier. These aren't utopian fantasies. They're practical policies, implemented successfully in various countries around the world. Nations with strong safety nets, less inequality, and rehabilitation-focused justice systems constantly show lower rates of violent crime. This doesn't mean ignoring individual responsibility. Lopez made horrific choices for which he deserved to be held accountable. But true accountability includes recognizing the social contexts that shape individual behavior. When we sensationalize killers while ignoring the conditions that produce them, we miss opportunities for prevention. When we focus exclusively on punishment rather than addressing root causes, we ensure that similar tragedies will reoccur. The most profound legacy of this case should be a commitment to building societies where vulnerable children receive protection, support, where mental health care is accessible to all, and where economic opportunity reaches every community, and where justice systems are equipped to both rehabilitate offenders and protect the public. The case of Pedro Alonso Lopez serves as a stark reminder of how systematic failures cascade into individual tragedies. From his troubled childhood to the eventual release, his story exposes the consequences of societies that fail their most vulnerable members. What makes the monster of the Andes particularly chilling is not just the number of his victims, but how their social economic status rendered them nearly invisible to the systems that should have protected them. Their lives mattered no less than anyone else's, yet they received far less protection and their deaths far less justice. As we conclude today's episode of Threads of Evil, we're left with challenging questions. How can we build social systems that prevent the creation of future predators? How can we ensure equal protection for all people regardless of their economic status? And how can we develop justice systems that prioritize public safety and rehabilitation over simplistic punishment? If you found this episode informative, please consider subscribing to Threads of Evil and leaving us a review. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light. Next week, we'll be examining another dark chapter in criminal history, always with an eye toward the broader social context. Until then, I'm Kai Lacrosse, reminding you that true safety comes not just from awareness, but from building more just and equitable communities. This episode of Threads of Evil was researched and written by Lacrosse and Diamond Ash. Our sound design and original music are by Thander Drake. Special thanks to our executive producers Vixen Fire, Tanya Kitskun, and Diamond Ash, and all our supporters.